Every writer knows that the best conversations about writing don't happen in classrooms or symposia or any other fancy artisanal setting. They happen at the bar, usually after deadline. That's the vibe we're going for here. This is The Other 51, Conversations About Writing with me, Brian Moritz. This week's guest is Dr. Kathy Roberts Forde, author and associate professor at the University of Massachusetts. Kathy, first of all, thank you so much for joining me today. I know it's a tough time in the semester for all of us, so I appreciate you taking the time.
I'm really excited to be doing this, Brian.
Are you guys done? Are you done with your semester at UMass?
We are. We just had graduation last weekend. All my grades are turned in.
Congratulations on that. That's the biggest deal of all.
Yeah, no kidding. So I'm able to turn my attention now after a couple of down days to research. It's what we all do during the summer, right?
Right. That's the fun stuff too. And I want to get to your research, and we're going to talk a lot about book writing because we met at a panel at the AEJMC conference last year that was titled "So You Want to Write a Book." And so I think a lot of us listening, and me included, want to write a book. So get advice from somebody who's been there before. But to start off, just tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of your own path to your current gig at UMass and what you do and kind of how you got landed there.
Sure. Well, I started my life as a grown-up as an English teacher, teaching middle and high school English. And I did that for well over 10 years before I decided, would really like to teach at the college level and have a life of the mind that was beyond the confines of a middle and high school campus. So I started looking at grad programs. It was between English and journalism because I loved, even though I didn't have a background in journalism, I was obviously a big reader of journalism as well as literature, fiction, and other types of narrative. And so I decided to get my PhD in journalism and mass comm because I was interested in this form called literary journalism. So I went and got my PhD at Chapel Hill. I figured out that when I was telling professors there in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, as it was called at the time, as I was telling them, I'm here because I'm interviewing for the Park Fellowship because I want to study literary journalism. And everyone was like, what? This was back in the early 2000s. And I think, I had to basically talk my way into that program by being quite confident that there was a way I could do this. And sure enough, I found a way to do it by studying history and law at Chapel Hill by specializing in those areas and then writing my dissertation, which became my first book, Mason v. New Yorker, Literary Journalism on Trial, Mason v. New Yorker and the First Amendment. So in any case, I graduated, got a job at the University of Minnesota as a historian there. Spent 4 really good years there. And then my husband never quite settled into the Midwest. And his mother was older. So we decided to try to get a gig back south. And so I then moved to the University of South Carolina, which allowed us to be near his mother for her final years. And then came here to the University of Massachusetts.
And how long have you been at UMass?
This is my 5th year.
Okay. And
I came here to be the department chair, and I did that for 3 years. And it's good, hard work, good, honest work. and then stepped down from that just so I could return to my research.
And so when you were a teacher before you were a professor, what was your subject area?
English.
Okay.
So I taught 7th through 12th grade, and we read literature, and we learned how to write together. I taught grammar. I taught everything under the sun that you would think of in a U.S. high school English class.
And what differences do you find, or what lessons do you take in the college classroom as a professor that maybe you learn from teaching 7th graders grammar or something along those lines?
That's such a good question. And I tell people all the time, like my ideal lifestyle as a teacher would be to teach 8th graders for part of the day and then grad students the other part of the day. And it's because, these younger ones, they're so open and curious and full of imagination and willing to try new things. And so some of my happiest memories teaching are with my 8th graders and having them do, Renaissance fairs, get on top of the desk, having someone on top of the desk, someone below doing the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet, or acting out the sword scenes in Romeo and Juliet. I mean, they just have so much fun with words and with each other at that age, and they're excited about learning. And it's not that college students aren't, but college students, their attention is so, there's so many claims on their attention. And kids in certainly middle school, high school, they have just as many claims, it seems. But I do think that, middle school kids are willing to, you can have their attention for that period. And if you can harness it in the right way, a lot of great learning can happen. So I would say it's less about I think what I learned about teaching is that it's on me to maintain not just control of the classroom environment, but to make things interesting for my students, no matter what the age, whether it's, 8th grade or whether it's graduate students, that it's on me to provide a really robust learning environment.
You mentioned studying literary journalism as kind of like your focal point of your dissertation and of your doctoral work. First of all, for maybe somebody listening who doesn't know, how do you define literary journalism? Yeah,
so it's been scholars of the forum argue about it a lot, how to define it, and so that's a debate that's ongoing. I think it will never end, and so I venture into any definitional zone with fear and trembling and great humility, because somebody is going to disagree with me vehemently. But I take a pretty capacious view of what could constitute literary journalism. So some people talk about it as a form of reportage, of journalism, of news reporting that uses narrative techniques, the techniques of fiction writers to tell a story. It often tends to be long form, although I think it can be short form as well. Some people have done it short form. I think another way to define it would be to say, any type of news reportage, any type of reporting and storytelling that's nonfiction in style, that relies upon some of the significant values of news reporting, but that also uses literary language and literary techniques that aren't necessarily narrative techniques, but they're literary in form, right? So they might be poetic forms, or not poems themselves, but some of the language forms you find in poetry, or it might just be a kind of essay form that has literary qualities, but isn't necessarily using scenes, narrative scenes, or plot or character to create the literary qualities of the work.
It was interesting. I was just reading a few articles this morning. I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole, and about like some of the classics in literary journalism that we view, and kind of looking at them now from with knowledge that some of the scenes that they wrote about may have been invented or exaggerated, or not strictly as factual as presented. Gates Eliza's work, Hunter Thompson's, Truman Capote, all like the Murderer's Row that everyone reads. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, there's a bit of a rabbit hole in itself, but how do you kind of teach that, reconcile that, these works that are, beautifully written and great pieces of writing, but when they're presented as journalism, that presents a kind of level of truth that maybe isn't reflected accurately. How do you kind of balance that in reading it and teaching it and approaching it?
It's a really good question. And it's, in some ways, that's one of the central questions that I grapple with in my book, Literary Journalism on Trial. Okay. So that was that book is about a case that involved the New Yorker magazine, which is a famous incubator for literary journalism, from the early 1920s on, in our literary culture in the repertorial culture in the United States. What I do is I just talk. I explain to students we talk about the social contract with the reader a lot, and we talk a lot about, when we claim that we're writing in particular forms or genres of writing, there's a particular contract with the audience, with the reader, that's understood, implied, even though if it's not strictly spelled out, right? And what we've come to understand, certainly I would say from the 1970s on, is that literary nonfiction, or this type of literary journalism, we expect it not to use composite characters. We expect it not to use invention, not to have invented scenes, not to use not to take liberties with the facts or with the actual. And so we expect it to be just as cleanly documented and as any type of other form of news reportage we expect to be, with all of the, adherence to news values and to news standards of professional journalism. But before that time, what the history of the form tells us is that a lot of these, there was a lot of experimentation from the late 19th century on up through the new journalism of the 1960s, where there just simply weren't conventions that were as solid as they are now. And so I think we often expect past works to be to represent what the consensus is now about what's fair and what's not in terms of genre, and what the standards are. And so I think it's good to approach it all with some degree of historical context and historical awareness. But you're right. I mean, when I teach books like Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, we read it, we talk about what our the norms are for journalistic storytelling now, and we look at all the parts that have been questioned as, inventions. Is it fair for Truman Capote's narrator to get inside the heads of these dead characters, right? I mean, so what's fair, what's not? And then, I don't have answers for the students. That's for them to figure out on their own.
Right. But the contextualization, I think, is important, because knowing that, it sounds like, and I haven't studied it, obviously, nearly as much as you do. I've just read the pieces, but it sounds like it was almost kind of like, correct me if I'm wrong, like a wink and a nod. Like you kind of understood that, like, you're going to invent some stuff for composite characters or take liberties. And that was just kind of like expected or allowed, maybe, or not questioned the way it would be today.
That's exactly right. And who knows which mix of those features that you just named off really beautifully it was. I mean, it's hard to know, but so much of it was just accepted and understood and shared to some degree among writers through whatever their folklore happened to be, as they told their stories to each other of how they did their writing.
Let's talk about your book too, because you mentioned it: Literary Journalism on Trial, Mason v. New Yorker and the First Amendment. And you said this came out of your dissertation?
It did.
Okay, so how did you kind of land on this topic?
Well, I owe it to my very first semester in the program at Chapel Hill. At the time when I started the program, we had just adopted my daughter from China, Zeta. She's now a junior in high school. We had just adopted her. I had entered this program as many doctoral students do. You're a perfectionist by nature anyway, because you're in a doctoral program. You're somebody who loves the world of ideas. You want to do really well. And so I had all those anxieties and self-doubt. And it was even worse than probably plenty of folks who find their way in a mass comm or a communications PhD, because I had entered it from an English background. My undergrad and master's degree were in English literature. And so when I entered it, I did not truly understand that I was getting a degree in social science. Mm-hmm. And so I'm in all these classes and I'm like, holy shit, what in the world is this? And this is not what I expected. And so I had that whole first semester was fraught with so many things, fraught with, oh my gosh, my daughter is in daycare and I'm all anxious about that. Oh my God, how am I going to be able to hold my own in this program? Oh my God, this is social science, how am I ever going to do what I want to do here? So I was taking a course called Mass Media Law, taught by Ruth Walden. And it was probably the hardest course I took in my PhD program. And we had to write original legal research papers, that could be eventually published, was the idea. And so I wanted right away. I was just, kind of single-mindedly a maniac trying to decide how I was going to write about literary journalism in this context. And a colleague of mine, who was a year ahead, said, "Hey, well, what about Mason v. New Yorker? There was this case that we learned about last year, when I took the class last year, that involved the New Yorker magazine and misquotation, defamation through misquotation with Janet Malcolm. There's some good characters. You should check it out." So I was like, So I read about the case. I was like, I'm going to write my legal research paper about this case. Mm-hmm. I did. And that case just raised so many fascinating, not only legal questions, but the story of it, like why it became such a case that was covered so thoroughly by the press, why it was so interesting to so many people, and then of course why it was argued over so much, and there was so much controversy surrounding it. So I wrote that article. It was a very kind of fairly simple legal article for that class. And it did well. It eventually got published in Common Law and Policy. And then I just, the more I moved through the program, I focused on that case very early on and said, this is the stuff of a book. And I can just focus on this. And in so many of my classes, I did different pieces. I did different research projects surrounding Mason v. New Yorker, that case.
Oh, that's the magic way. If any masters or doc students are listening to this, if you can find your dissertation topic early on and use all the classes to build like your lit review or different aspects of it, that's huge. So you write this, you do it as your dissertation. Now, what's the leap from dissertation to book?
That's a very good question, and I think that's the question that so many doctoral students, former doctoral students, assistant professors, you have to decide whether what you have is a book. And I had decided when I was a doctoral student that this was a book. And so I wrote it with the idea that it was going to be a book from before I even began writing a dissertation. And that required talking to my committee members, and particularly my chair, who was Ruth Walden, who was my law professor. And I just made the argument to her and to some of my members who were from the history department, and then who were historians in the journalism school, that this is something that I really needed to be given the freedom to write it as a book without some of the perfunctory chapters that are often parts of dissertations. So I said, I don't need a literature review in my dissertation because all of my footnotes will be the literature review. So trust me, people, please don't make me write. How arrogant was I? I was in my early 30s, so I was probably more arrogant or more willing to push the envelope and make arguments for myself and how I wanted to do things. By the time I was finished, I was in my mid 30s. So in any case, I wrote it from the beginning without some of the apparatus that you expect in a dissertation. There was not a methods chapter. There was not a literature review chapter. And, it was a work of history and legal analysis. And so I had to convince one of the legal scholars on my committee that I did not need the literature review and that I did not need a methods chapter, or a theory chapter. And once I managed to make those arguments, then I was able to write the dissertation more as a book. But your question was, again,
that leap from dissertation to book. I mean, it sounds like you did a lot of because a lot of the heavy lifting for most dissertations or most papers would be you have a method section. Books don't have a method section. You have specific literature review chapters where you go through all the different literature that's been written before. That's not in a book. So you had it. I'm not saying you had it easier, but you had it a little more packaged, more like a book. But I kind of want to maybe go back to another question. You deciding that it's a book, and you decided that it was a book, or you knew it was a book. Tell me about that decision. How do you know something's a book?
So in my case, I knew it was a book because there was so much about that case, that there are so many questions I had that I was asking about that case, that really got to the very nature and the very history of literary journalism. Like, what is literary journalism, and why is it so popular here in the 2000s? What were these debates going on around the Mason v. New Yorker case in the 1980s and the early 1990s, when this case was alive in the federal court systems, that fascinated people, especially journalists, so much that they were arguing about it, across the landscape of journalism, and how did we get, what were the past trajectories of more a traditional daily form or a traditional professional journalism that you find in newspapers and certain kinds of news magazines versus this other kind of journalism, this narrative or literary journalism that we find in places like the New Yorker, that are then turned into books that are found in the Atlantic and Harper's and other kinds of, and in long series that some newspapers were publishing at the time. So there were just so many big questions. I knew I needed the length of a book to answer them. But the characters involved in this case, it was Janet Malcolm of the New Yorker, who is a famous writer and is a character in and of herself, and has written all kinds of controversial statements about the nature of journalism and the nature of writing. And then there's Jeffrey Mason, who she wrote a profile of him. And this was the profile. He was the director of the Forde archives at the time she was writing her profile of him for the New Yorker magazine that became the subject of this libel case, Mason v. New Yorker. And the guy was just an incredible character. He claimed, she did the immersive form of interviewing with him, immersive reporting. So she interviewed him for hundreds of hours, and along the way, turned out he claimed he had slept with over 1,000 women. He claimed that he was an intellectual gigolo, which of course is one of the phrases that was at contest in the libel case. He was an extraordinary talker, an extraordinary thinker and writer himself, but also just I don't want to say outrageous, but just an incredibly colorful person with a really interesting mind and had led a really interesting life. And so, you can only imagine what she thought when he was such a voluble talker. He talked a lot, and she was able to get so much of his life and his work as the director of the Forde archives and all the controversies that he was involved in. She got it all on tape and just had this immense treasure trove of material to work with for her profile of him. And so I think I've gotten a little off track here, Brian. I think there was so much material to work with, and journalists themselves wrote about the case endlessly and followed it through its 13-year life in the federal court system, all the way to the Supreme Court and back down to the lowest level of the federal courts. Just that the journalists who wrote about them and the journalism itself that was written about this case was also provided just rich context for. And the New Yorker magazine, that's a fascinating magazine to write about. Mm-hmm. And I worked in the New Yorker archives too.
So when you're kind of going through all of that, and I remember you mentioning this at your talk at AEJ, you've got all of this material and all this great material. How do you, as a writer, kind of settle on narrative? Because I remember you saying how important that narrative hook or that narrative story is to a piece, like to a book. So how did you, in this case, how do you take this information that you have, all this research, and then figure out the narrative that you want to tell?
Well, you're right, and I'm having to think back through a number of years here, but there were certain time periods or pieces of the story of the case that just chunked themselves out nicely, and within them you could see there were certain characters or people or ideas or conversations that were ripe for narrative, for using storytelling to tell that part of the story. So, for example, in kind of my first, I have an introduction in the book and then a first chapter. In that first chapter, I tell the story of one of the trials. There were two trials in the case after the case had worked its way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had further elaborated on the actual malice standard in the context of the facts of the case, and they sent it back down to the lower court for trial. And so one of the trials was such a vivid story, the trial itself. And I was able to piece together that story from all of the news reports on the trial and things that Jeffrey Mason had said, and through doing oral histories with some of the lawyers involved in the case. So I knew that telling the story of that trial would make vivid and dramatic the characters in the case, what was at stake, and it would allow me to kind of set the scene and tell a vivid story in that chapter. So there was that. And then there was another chapter that was just about how the New Yorker magazine dealt with libel cases from its very beginning in 1925, all the way up through almost up to the when it had to deal with the Mason v. New Yorker case. And so to tell that chapter, I had worked in the New Yorker records at the New York Public Library and had gone through all of their legal files that had anything to do with libel cases. So I had worked in those boxes and boxes and folders of records. And there were just fascinating little stories about different libel cases that were being lodged against the New Yorker. And they had in-house counsel and out-of-house counsel dealing with these people who were filing libel suits. And so the lawyers themselves became vivid characters, and you could see how they talked with the editors of the magazine about these libel claims, and how they, tried to wear out these libel claimants by just, making things last forever. And they were fascinating stories. There was one woman who they had written about in a story called, I think it was called The Cat Woman or The Cat Lady, maybe The Cat Woman, but they had written a profile about this woman and all of her cats, and she sued. And, she was just an absolute character. And so there were just lots of interesting stories like that could be told in just short episodic and short stories all pieced together throughout this chapter about these libel cases the New Yorker had to deal with. And at the same time, you're telling these individual, interesting or funny or odd or strange stories about different libel cases. You also had the overarching story, which is here's how a magazine, a really important magazine, dealt with libel cases across several decades during which libel law is changing in the United States. Because during that time, New York Times v. Sullivan, the 1964 case, where libel law becomes to some degree constitutionalized, happens. Mm-hmm. And so and you see the magazine having to struggle with New York Times v. Sullivan and what that means for them afterwards.
So, this book came out about 10 years ago, and are you writing a second book? Is it coming out? The second book is, where are you in that? I remember you were under contract last summer.
Yeah, so I've got a couple of books that are in the works right now. One is sole authored. It's a reading and publication history of James Baldwin's For Next Time. And that book has been through so many different imaginings for me. And it's been under contract for a long time, and I still haven't finished it and I keep changing how I want to deal with it. And I think I've just come up with a new way that it will finally allow me to write the thing. So that book is still in process. I had to do so much back reading and education of myself in African-American history and African-American print culture and the Black freedom struggle in order to write that book, that so much of what I've been doing is more and I've done a lot of research on the book, but I've also had to get comfortable with new areas of historiography. So that, I think that one will be written soon. This other book that I'm working on now that's going to come out probably and it should come out in 2020, is an edited book. And I've got a lot of, I've lined up some really excellent historians from departments of history, but also from journalism. And it's a book called Journalism and Jim Crow. University of Georgia Press is interested. We're getting the final materials to them for external review this next month. Not the final, the final several book chapters and the proposal, et cetera. And that book it's about how white newspaper publishers and editors joined forces with industrialists and government officials in the South from post-Civil War up to 1940 to build white supremacy. And so it's the role of the white press in building white supremacy in the South post-Civil War. And it's fascinating. It will be the most important book I do, I think, because hardly anyone's touched this history. It's other than the role of white newspapers in lynching and, furthering, sadly, lynching and participating to some degree even in fomenting lynchings in the South. This other story has largely been untouched, except perhaps for work on the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. So, and what it demonstrates, I think, really powerfully is, how the press has not always served democratic ends or the ends of justice, but has actually been a potent player in some of the worst atrocities and injustices in our country's history. And that, journalism and communication, it can be a really important and has been really powerful historical actor in and of its own as an institution. And that we need to be aware of this so that we can, that as journalists, as people who teach journalism, as readers of journalism, we need to take very seriously the role that communication, media, and journalism play as actors with not just soft power, but a kind of hard power too in public life.
So like I mentioned earlier, the panel I saw you at was So You Want to Write a Book. For those of us who want to write a book, I don't ask what should we know? Like, what's maybe one or two things that prospective authors or people who think they have a book in them should know about before they start along this process?
The first thing one of the first things I talked to when I was teaching graduate students and working with students who were writing dissertations that they wanted to become books, I would give them this book, Thinking Like Your Editor by Susan Rabiner and Alfred.
This book right here?
Yeah, that book right there.
I bought it after your talk last year, so.
Yeah, so this book, it even though it's written for people who want to write serious nonfiction and publish it as trade books, not necessarily academic or university press books or academic books, it is by far the best advice you can get about writing a book. And so I always buy it for my graduate students. I give them a copy. It's inexpensive. It's been around for a long time. And it helps students think about how to structure their book by chapters. It helps them understand how to write a book proposal to send to a university press. So the very first thing I think people should do when they want to write a book is to read this book because it just steps them through the process of thinking about audiences, how to write a book for an audience, and who is your audience, and what are the big, what are the big questions your book is asking, and how do you answer them in a way that your audience is going to be interested in and will take seriously? What about your book is new? How are you contributing something new to a conversation? What is your argument? Right? That these are all of the things you want to think about ahead of time. And also, how do you contextualize whatever your topic is within the world of people and institutions and human life, right? I mean, especially, in communication and media, as in any subject, so much is abstract. And so many book writers may be writing a book where they aren't even thinking about characters, right? But they're always people. There are always people. There's always things happening. There's always events. There's always institutions. There are always institutions. So even if you're writing about an idea in journalism or something, that we were talking about a book you might want to write eventually about player access in sports, like how do journalists get access to players? Is that what you meant by that?
Yeah,
player access
and that relationship. Yeah.
Yeah, in that relationship. So, kind of an abstract idea, but the only way you're going to be able to write that book is to give example after example after example of journalists getting access to particular players and the problems with it, or the great the moments when it worked particularly well and where there was a really rich relationship that was built between the journalist and the player. So, I think thinking about, you've got that abstract idea, player access, but then putting it down into actuality in the world of people and events and institutions.
Yep, I was thumbing through this before our talk today, and one of the things that stood out, and I'm paraphrasing, is basically like, if you want to, you can write whatever you want and digitally, and now we have this ability. But if you're going to write for an actual press, an actual book that's going to print it, you need to kind of, it didn't say this, she's much nicer, but you need to get over yourself and kind of think about, okay, this is not for me. This is a book for people. And you have to think about, how am I going to sell this book to an editor? Because they have to figure out how they're going to sell it to who they have to sell it to. And that's an incredibly valuable piece of advice, I think.
Yeah, it really is. And, a lot of us, we publish not with trade. I mean, our dream and eventually my dream is this, I bet yours is too, that I want to publish a trade book because, you get to a much bigger audience that way. And in some cases, some lucky few actually get advances, right? Working with that, if you are writing that kind of book. But to write the kind of scholarly work that, most of us academics write, we still should be thinking about audience, right? Because it helps when we're writing our proposals that we then share. We send out proposals to university presses or to commercial presses, whoever is our target presses. When we send out our proposals, we need to be able to make the argument straight away in a really engaging way of why anyone is going to want to read our book. And even though it may not be a massive group of readers who are going to want to read our book, we need to make clear that what we're writing about there are those who are going to read it because it matters to them and it matters to their field. It might matter to students who are learning a subject, right? So we have to be able to make that argument really compellingly in the proposal that we send out, and then make it again in the introduction of our book. Mm-hmm. Right?
So I ask everybody I have on my podcast this question. So I'll ask you, what's the best thing you've read lately?
Oh, my God. I'm reading the biography, David Blight's biography of Frederick Douglass.
Ooh, excellent.
And so I've just started it. It is extraordinary. I'm just in love with it. And so much of my reading these days, like I read, so much of my reading is professional and, it's for research that I'm doing. So most of that reading is all in books. Mm-hmm. But all my other reading I do as an audiobook.
Oh, okay.
And I'm a huge fan of podcasts, a huge fan of audio storytelling, and a huge fan of audio books. And so I'm listening to the David Blight biography of Frederick Douglass. It won the Pulitzer Prize this year. It's just extraordinary.
I'm excited to read that because Frederick Douglass lived in Rochester, where I live, up in Western New York. So I'm really excited. It's on my list to read. It just sounds like an incredible work. It
is. And the narrator, at least the audiobook, the narrator, the reader is has a wonderful voice and is an extraordinarily talented reader, narrator. And so that also makes it terrific. And David Blight's just an extraordinary historian.
Mm-hmm. Well, Kathy, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining me this week.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
As always, thanks for listening to The Other 51. You can find show notes for this episode and all our episodes at sportsmediaguy.com on the Other 51 tab. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. I can highly recommend Overcast for this. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz.